So, without further ado, I'm going to do a brief introduction to this morning's plenary panel. This panel is sponsored and organized by the CES Fellows. And as you heard yesterday at the awards luncheon, the CES Fellowship recognizes lifetime achievements and service to evaluation in Canada. And at the 2016 conference, the CES initiated a Fellows Strand, which provides an opportunity to bring high-profile evaluation leaders to come address critically important evaluation issues. Today, we're really lucky and privileged to have two plenary events that have been sponsored by the Fellows. We're beginning this morning with a panel discussion on evaluation for the Anthropocene. A panel which my panel chair advises me needs no further introduction, so I'm not going to do one. However, to set the stage for the panel, I am once again going to acknowledge territory. We respectfully and gratefully acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearpaw, and Wesley First Nations. And of course, the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, and we want to thank and honor the first peoples of this land. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andy Rowe, who needs no introduction.
Kia ora, I'm Kate McKee.
Kia ora, I'm Nan Wehi Peihana. This was a developmental evaluation funded by a mainstream government organisation where we blended Māori knowledge systems with Western knowledge systems.
Yeah, so I was doing some evaluation capacity building work in a New Zealand government organisation, and I was working with a manager in that organisation. When he came to me and he said, I've got this paper that's come to me from another part of the organisation, and it's about this new Māori initiative. And he wanted me to help develop the paper as a board paper to get it through the funding system. So he gave me some background papers, and as soon as I saw them, I realised that this was something I really shouldn't be leading.
So why didn't you think you could lead the work, Kate?
Well, good question, Nan. Hey, well, it was Māori. It was about Māori. It was about Māori well-being. It was about Māori communities leading their pathway to well-being. And I'm not Māori. I'm happy to support when I'm invited, but I could see the project was coming from a deeply Māori space, and it was drawing on traditional and contemporary mātauranga Māori, Māori knowledge, Māori systems, Māori ways of knowing things, and it really needed Māori cultural expertise. I recognised that we were going to have to blend that with traditional Western knowledge systems because we were working in a government context as well, and it wouldn't work in the context that we were to have me leading this piece of work. It needed somebody Māori to support and lead the work. The organisation only had 2 or 3 Māori staff, and so I was worried about the capacity of the organisation to lead this work. I knew that the program manager, the new program, this initiative, that she was really competent and really grounded. She was Māori, really grounded in that Māori world, but she could really do with some help. And she needed somebody who could walk in both worlds, somebody who knew policy, somebody who spoke the language, and I thought of you.
Thank you, Kate. At that stage, it wasn't about evaluation. It was about guiding a very Māori concept and idea through a government agency policy process to secure funding and a commitment to change. And the policy got through. We won't tell you all about the rest. And the timing meant that the evaluation was able to walk alongside the program development, which is actually really highly unusual in New Zealand. And the evaluation went to tender, and fortunately, we won the work.
Yeah, so right from the get-go, we recognised that we would be collaborating on this journey, that we would be bringing together Māori knowledge systems with Western knowledge systems. But, you know, given the deeply Māori cultural context, our starting point was always Te Ao Māori, or the Māori world view perspective. We had to use a process that was going to fit in the Māori world, where the communities that we were working with and the tribal organisations would feel comfortable, but more than that, that they would feel affirmed about who they were and that their expertise and knowledge was legitimate. We knew we had to use Māori ways of working in the process and design what we were doing so that it actually fitted in that Māori world if it was going to have any chance whatsoever of making a difference.
So our design workshops were located on marae, which are our traditional meeting places. And being on marae meant that Māori customs and Māori protocols were the norm. It's just what you do when you're in someone else's space. And so that meant turning up and staying the whole night, sleeping in our traditional wharenui, our very big meeting houses. And when you're on the marae and you're doing this kind of work, one of the typical processes, we kind of talk into the night. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of laughter, as well, but there's a lot of deep discussion. That's just really a natural thing that happens on the marae. It's just very Māori. So as I said, on the marae, Māori practices, Māori norms, Māori language prevails. And one of the things that I notice is that what I call different currency operates. So those who perhaps had status or were considered knowledgeable in the Pākehā world, the white settler world, their knowledge didn't necessarily transfer into the space. It didn't have the same currency. It wasn't that it wasn't important, but it just didn't have the same currency in that context.
Yeah, and that actually, I noticed that too, Nan, and I noticed that it actually applied to the evaluation process as well. So we were no longer experts. We were evaluators, but we weren't experts in the Māori world. Oh, that was except you and Kataraina, who I was working with, and they became no longer, Nan wasn't Nan the evaluator. She was Nan, and Kataraina was Kataraina. They were Māori, and they transferred into that Māori world just seamlessly, speaking the language, speaking the reo, and being totally immersed in that Māori culture. It really did change. One of the things that came out of it was that we developed a framework called Te Rehua, Te Whitu Rehua, which is a Māori star. And incorporates 5 key concepts and principles that make up what it means to participate in Māori sport and recreation as Māori. It has 5 kind of concepts on the star. Each point of the star, the top one there is about the language, Te Reo Māori. The one on the 4 Māori is about collective, intergenerational, working as groups, as family. The next one is about places of significance to Māori. It's about the land, the whenua. Then there's also another point of the star that's about doing traditional Māori activity. And then there's another point which is about whether Māori control or own what's going on, so the governance and management of activity. This framework was deeply grounded in Māori concepts, but it actually also travelled in the Western world, didn't it, Nan?
Yeah.
It really travelled there.
So we still had to cover off all of the traditional trappings for evaluation that the funder was looking for. So yes, while we did a lot of, so we worked through using a lot of Māori protocols and Māori methods, and we also did, dare I say, utilising administrative data, using monitoring data, some quantitative surveys, some key stakeholder interviews. So it really was a blending of kind of Māori worldviews, Māori knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems. But we always started, I think, from a Te Ao Māori, a Māori world point of view, privileging Māori knowledge and ways of working. And when I think about this experience, there were kind of 3 things that really stand out for me. I think the first one is that there's a need to recognise that the project, or we did recognise that the project was deeply embedded within a deeply Indigenous or Māori context, and that required Māori knowledge and expertise. I think the second point was we always started from a Māori or Indigenous perspective. That was our first point of call, and then we would bring our Western knowledge and our Western systems. And I think that really equates to our third point, is that there was always a blending. There was always a blending, but we were starting from Māori and bringing in non-Māori.
Yeah, I guess what we were doing was we weren't browning a Western model, we were actually massaging a Māori model for white Pākehā consumption in this context. And actually that's kind of similar to something we did, wasn't it kind of similar to, we did this presentation one time on this at a conference, and we had a panel. And on our panel were ourselves as well as a couple of our Māori community providers. They joined us at this conference, and our other colleague, Kataraina, we'd asked her to be our discussant. And one of the things she did was, and this was a true sign of blending, and she was like, what the hell is a discussant? And so we said, okay, well, you kind of have to sum up what's going on at the conference, what went on in the panel. And in true Māori style, she transformed that role of discussant into a Māori way of doing things. She picked up her guitar, didn't she? And it was quite a surprise to us. She picked up her guitar and sang a song. Take it away. Take it away.
This has been a courageous journey, following in the footsteps of our ancestors. Our ancestors. This has been a courageous journey, following in the footsteps of our ancestors. Our ancestors. Our grandmother said, our grandfather said, hold on, hold on. Traditions and rituals, customary ways that are grounded, that were born of another time and place. Don't be afraid, you can be yourself. Let who you are be your guiding star. Don't be afraid, you can be yourself. Let who you are be your guiding star. It's all about the next generation, for they know what they know. The world will be a better place when we find a way to claim the space for them. Don't be afraid, you can be yourself. Let who you are be your guiding star. Don't be afraid, you can be yourself. Let who you are be your guiding star. This has been a courageous journey, following in the footsteps of our ancestors.
I want to thank Kate and Nan for opening our session. Are we having sound problems? Okay, I want to thank Kate and Nan for opening our session, and we have an excellent panel, and we're dealing with a very challenging topic, and a topic that is quite urgent for evaluation to start addressing, and for which we're not particularly well resourced to deal with. We have a lot of learning to do, and the worldview of sustainability is a worldview of coupled human and natural systems. And the definition of sustainability is that we leave the world, we take from the current world what we need without impairing in any way the ability of future generations to do the same. And as part of that, because we are taking, I think it's important that we're talking about coupled human and natural systems, and everything we do has a tremendous cost to the natural system. And while recognizing the significant efforts of this conference, of the hotel, and of the city of Calgary to reduce the harm that we do to the environment and make our living days more part of the environment, we should recognize too the destruction to the homes, to the habitat, and to the livelihoods of all the species that used to live on this space. So, we have some starting assumptions for this panel, and they're up there for you to see. I'm not going to read them or speak to them. The fundamental one is we're talking about coupled human and natural systems. We have a lot of learning to do, and the story as it unfolds, as Indigenous evaluation develops, and as we decolonize our approaches in evaluation and ourselves. There's a lot to learn for us about how we bring different systems together. Systems that historically have been in conflict, development versus environment, to bring them to a place where they can work together in a sustainable way. So we now move over to the panel. We're not going to do introductions to the panel because we're going to be tight for time and people are just going to start.
Morning. What you didn't see in my bio that I think is important perspective for the discussion this morning is that my career has been working with different perspectives on worldviews on sustainability. I first started in the forest industry. I'm a professional forester by training and background in Western science, industrial forestry. For the last 6 years, I've been working with the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission, regulating the oil and gas industry. So a different perspective on resource extraction, resource management. Both of throughout my career, it's been involved with stakeholders, First Nations, general public, kind of right in the middle of what Andy and the opening story talked about, that conflict. But the perspective has always been from a Western science point of view. And I would say out of the successes successes in quotes that we've had over my career, no one is really happy with the results out of a resolution to an issue. While I was listening to the opening story, a thought flashed into my mind. And I was at a recent annual general meeting of the Association of BC Professional Foresters. So pretty straightforward, Western, a lot of down-to-earth people, forest workers. And one of the guest speakers was a fellow named David Usher, and he's a contemporary singer, very popular. And he sang to the crowd. And I've never seen so many shocked faces of professional foresters. They didn't know what to do. Really. It was just so weird. Why would you be singing and communicating in a softer, different way at an annual meeting? And it really struck me as odd, but the right thing to do. And afterwards, there was a lot of conversation throughout the day of, well, that was kind of weird, wasn't that? And, people were, but it really resonated. And I think I took it as a sign that things are slowly changing. With that organization and with the broader institutions. So I've got some pictures up on the slides. They just kind of encapsulate kind of the themes I'm going to be talking about. The one on your left is a boreal caribou, highly endangered species in northeast British Columbia. The one beside that are some buffalo bison that were reintroduced in northeast British Columbia to help bring back some of the traditional First Nation species. There's a pipeline, of course. I work for the Oil and Gas Commission. And then in the far end, there's a picture of just some recreation, what I like to do in my spare time. We're playing in the mountains in a snowstorm. So 3 questions that I was going to talk about this morning. The first off, and it builds on the themes that we've heard this morning, is how do we define sustainability? And I'm going to construct something that's deliberate to illustrate the 2 different points of view. The first is I think everyone is familiar with, there's a Western worldview. It's a reductionist approach, traditional science. It's backstopped by a foundation of resource management science, laws, and institutions. I work for one of those institutions, and we're focused on resource development. The efforts are really focused at optimizing or maximizing the extraction of the resource while minimizing impacts to natural systems. Sustainability from this worldview is really heavily weighted to sustaining resource extraction and treating other values as secondary objectives at the best, or a nuisance at the worst. So very much of a deconstructive us-you sort of approach. You contrast that with another worldview perspective is cultural spiritual, which focuses on the interconnectedness of people, tradition, practices, teachings, social structures, all woven together by a fabric of resource stewardship. Very different look. Much more interconnected, and really everything is on an equal footing. Species and things are on an equal footing, and clearly there's a tension between those 2 worldviews. So when you look at defining sustainability, it's kind of the 2 bookends. In my world, recently the federal government has introduced, and it's been supported by the British Columbia government, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's transformational for Canada, for British Columbia. In addition, the British Columbia government has fully adopted the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, foundational in British Columbia, as well as supporting the Chilcotin Supreme Court decision for the Chilcotin people in what's known as the Caribou area of British Columbia. So with those 3 adoptions, it's rocked Western science in British Columbia. People just, it's like David Usher singing to the foresters. It's people just don't know what to think. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of change, but it's a real challenge to the institutions. Our definition of sustainability needs to change. We have a socially active government. It's a new Democratic Green Party coalition, just a slight majority over the Liberal government. A lot of tension. So our challenge is to try and forge and bring closer. So in terms of definition of sustainability, we're kind of in the cauldron right now trying to work it out in the midst of a seismic change in how society looks at this, trying to integrate these 2 perspectives and worldviews. And there's not a lot of guidance. So it's pretty fascinating. The second question, up on the screen, hopefully, yep, is what's our perspective or worldview on the environment? And it's kind of a little bit more detail than what I was just talking about. Is it a utilitarian? So do we view the environment as one to be utilized? The degree or impact defined by our level of tolerance to risk. I have a tolerance to risk. Everyone on the panel has probably a different tolerance to environmental risk, and I'm sure everyone in the room has a different tolerance. Western science, the institutions, the universities are in control. And so that inherent tolerance to risk is baked right into the laws and legislation, practices, policies, guidelines, everything that we use on a day-to-day basis. So that's the starting point of where this conversation is on environment. And really the question that I ask and that I think a lot of people are asking now is do you just keep doing things until science says no? And when you get into these arguments throughout my career, it's really hard to prove a negative. So science really never says no. So there's this construct that's set up that's very difficult, and the challenge that's put down in front of us is to change the status quo. If your perspective is spiritual, cultural, there might be a tendency to review resource extraction impacts not as a tolerance to risk, but as a threat to your livelihood, your culture, your identity. So like it was characterized in the opening story, just a very different perspective and approach to the environment. The trick, I guess, in the issue is that both are valid. One doesn't trump the other. The trick is to how do you integrate the two worldviews? Because sustainability is some sort of combination. I think we're moving from a Western view of sustainability to some more integrated approach, and that's just not well defined. So naturally, talking to a group of evaluators, how do you evaluate sustainability? I don't have any answers. I think we can look at it from a Western science perspective. We have a lot of tools. There's some real high-end tools I think people are familiar with that are assess impacts. Lots of programming tools. There are professional faculties devoted to analysis. The tools are data intensive, and they come with really wide error bars, and they're not really, again, I come back to the David Usher example. It's singing a song to a bunch of foresters in a business meeting. Like it just doesn't incorporate the cultural side with the tools that we have. I'm involved with a process right now in Northeast British Columbia that's been going on for 3 years to try and bridge these two worldviews. It's 3 years. It's very labor and time intensive, and we're on the traditional territory of Treaty 7. In Northeast British Columbia, it's traditional territory for Treaty 8. In British Columbia, there are 7 bands in Treaty 8, and there are 6 of the 7 at the table that we're negotiating with on trying to incorporate worldviews into a decision-making process for the Oil and Gas Commission as well as for forestry and others. However, just to explain the complexity of the problem, there are 4 non-treaty First Nations that also have Aboriginal rights, asserted rights over the area. Within British Columbia, there are a total of 209 different bands throughout. So I've been working for 3.5 years with 6 out of 7. 4 aren't represented, and all of the territories overlap. It's a very, very complicated situation. So we have a process, but we don't necessarily have the tools to be efficient and move this forward. And maybe that's the wrong view. Maybe I'm having the wrong view on the problem, but there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of angst to move forward and develop and change. So what do? Do we just use the precautionary principle and throttle back and say, okay, we're just going to wait until science directs us to do something? And there's a lot of consequences with that. That's one approach. I think that we need a more collaborative approach. That's Andy talked about it, and I really like the language, is coupling human and natural systems. So how do we couple the Western science that the institutions and a lot of society is based on? How do you couple that with human systems? We need a system that acknowledges both the extraction and reductionist focus, as well as the cultural focus, and that ideally incorporates both to create a new model that is supported by both perspectives. So when I was asked to speak at this morning session, I was very honored. I've never spoken to a room full of social scientists. It's usually engineers, foresters, geologists, bureaucrats, that sort of thing. So it was a really good opportunity for me to stop and sit back and reflect on what to say. So again, it's been a really positive learning experience for me to come forward and talk. And so the challenge to the group, I would say, is that we, British Columbia, I'm not speaking on behalf of government, this is not an official government thing. It's me coming out to talk. But I know we in British Columbia, and I'm sure across the panel, we're looking for help to build the tools. We have one set of tools and we have some processes. And that's what really intrigued me, is that you guys are evaluators. This is what you do. You know systems. You have the social human systems expertise. There's a lot of Western science stuff out there that needs help to move forward into this, into helping define what sustainability could look like. So the question really is, how do we blend?
Alrighty, let's see if this works. Say forward. All right, there's my bio. Take a look. Okay, moving on. All right. Hi, my name is Patrick Field. I work for a group called the Consensus Building Institute. We are based in the U.S. in a few places, including Boston, Massachusetts, and we have our first full-time Canadian employee based out of Montreal, we're excited to say. Andy said I've got 8 minutes to catch up on time, so we'll see how I do. I am a consensus builder, a facilitator, mediator, so why the heck am I here? So I'm going to talk just a little bit about process and particularly about coupled systems and how I think kind of the work that we do trying to bring people together to solve problems and evaluation might come together. So my first slide is really just to say there's a method, at least we think, for what we call consensus building or building agreement. And what's interesting in much of the work that we do at CBI, both in the US and Canada and internationally, from kind of sort of global problems all the way down to local problems, is understand that usually complex systems, no one person has their mind around them. And both in terms of interdisciplinary specialties, in terms of human and natural systems, in terms of perspectives of culture and whatever it may be, it takes everyone to get in the room together to begin to understand these very complex systems. And that's messy because people are messy, right? As Sartre said, hell is other people. And boy, if you've ever been in a group process of 30 people on a committee, you often think that. So what we try to do is really help people come together and solve complex problems together and interweaving a number of issues and the like. And so we have a method, so to speak, to do that. I just want to say there's a few challenges to this. Well, there's a lot of challenges, but a few I want to name is, this is a pretty Western-looking diagram, which I'll get to in a second to try to offer a different perspective around what began our really excellent panel. I would also say that there's a challenge, is it's really hard to invite nature to the table. It doesn't necessarily speak the language. It doesn't necessarily have a place at the table. If granted one, it's not clear what to do with it when the bear's sitting at the table, other than eating your breakfast. So really it comes to really how do we have proxies for doing that from indigenous perspectives, from sort of layperson's perspectives out in the community who may see and witness at least localized environments in a way that specialists never actually see, all the way to the best science that we can bring in a way that actually helps people come together to find what we call joint fact-finding rather than everyone bringing their independent science together. So again, consensus building a method, it can actually be used in building agreement, it can actually be used in evaluation, which it has been in some cases. My second slide here, hopefully. I have to do 2 clicks here. It is just to say that as we try to integrate systems, we try to integrate ways of thinking, there are some significant challenges. So I just want to kind of note, and I know this has been a theme throughout your conference, is that it is really difficult to engage and integrate Western and indigenous models and understanding. So this slide is really based on a case where we were working with the Department of Interior in the United States and many tribes, and they're really trying to come up with methods for assessing cultural resource loss due to Superfund sites, big contaminated sites. Some of these things are huge, like old nuclear defense sites. And how do you actually value the loss to indigenous peoples of certain activities, spiritual sustenance, whatever it might be, over decades or longer? And there's a significant problem with how to do this because the courts require you to come up with a dollar number. What's the resource loss that we can value so we can ascribe blame, we can allocate cost, someone pays, we're done, justice is done, we move on. And that is actually really complicated. So on kind of, I think, what you're left is really what we see in the Western system is defensible, it's repeatable. Value are primarily numerics. We want to quantify things. Things are objects that we study. They're measurable, as I noted. They're often we have to break them apart and fractionate them and define them and separate them and put them into kind of our categories to really understand them in Western ways of thinking. And that is completely antithetical to the way that a culture, indigenous culture in particular, or tribes in the United States, will really think about cultural resources. If I have a cultural resource, a particular plant that I've not been able to harvest for decades for some reason, if I'm not able to plant corn because of an Army Corps dam and messing up a groundwater system that has a lot more significance than just feeding my people, I don't need to defend my spiritual practices. They're unique. The values that I hold have things that go far beyond ways that I can sort of put them into dollars. That it's interesting that a lot of these things that we as Westerners treat as objects, First Peoples are actually subjects. So in the Maliseet language, for instance, I work with the Maliseet, New Brunswick, and Maine, the notion is that trees and water, a very complicated language I do not in any way understand, those things are not actually objects, they're subjects, just like human beings. And so they have to be treated very differently. And lastly is when you think about these coupled systems and from an indigenous perspective and hopefully from a sustainability perspective, they're not fractionated, they're not broken apart, they're not divided, they're holistic, they're multi-layered, they're inseparable, and that gets really hard then to understand, and how do we actually make sense of these systems collectively? So this is a real challenge to actually figure out how to do this well. One case I just want to talk about for 2 minutes and 55 seconds is really just thinking about actually a case and where we're really trying to think about coupled systems. And we're working on a case in the Willistook watershed, also known as the St. John, and hopefully soon formally known as the St. John watershed, which is actually one of the largest river systems in the eastern part of the United States and Canada, other than the Susquehanna. And it's a remarkable, beautiful, relatively actually unknown resource in many ways. It flows from Maine up through Quebec, through New Brunswick, and then out to the Atlantic. And there, the Maliseet Nation, which encompasses bands and tribe, both across the border in Quebec and New Brunswick as well, is really trying to regain governance to some degree of the river. Well, what does that mean? That's a complicated question. And so we're really trying to pull together a consensus building process over time to do a number of things. And just real quickly, this slide just emphasizes a number of kind of knowledge systems and people, what we're trying to bring together. One is just a map of the river system from a classic kind of Western mapping of a system. The bottom charts show actually the return of salmon to the upper St. John Willistook River, which actually, as you can see, is horrible. It's declined dramatically for a set of reasons, primarily extraordinarily large, successful dams on the river, but not to mention there's farming practices, sedimentation, phosphorus, nutrients, eutrophication, all those things. And then there's a beautiful picture of an old picture many years ago of a Maliseet child with a salmon when they were that large and magnificent. So what I want to raise is this interesting question of how you think about evaluating this process. Because there's really multiple goals in this particular effort, of which is not unlike many we work on. The first and most important goal, and obviously a thrust of this current government in Canada, is reconciliation. And those are fundamental questions of justice and relationships and power, and that's a big goal for this process. And oftentimes myself as a Westerner and the mediator of the process constantly goes back to what's our problem and can we think about which restoration project we're going to go after and what we're going to monitor. And my colleague who's Maliseet from the Maliseet Nation Conservation Commission has to constantly remind me, that's all well and good, Pat, but there's actually a bigger goal here, and we've got to tend to the relationships. We have to tend to the reconciliation, and things must fall underneath that broad rubric. Secondly is this question of shared governance, which is a political administrative question, and how do we do it, how do we evaluate that, especially when the status quo is very powerful, as you know, and there are plenty vested interests who do not want to see anything change. Third is this notion of collaboration, which can be around any number of things around measuring, monitoring, and restoring natural resources, of figuring out how to return salmon to the upper St. John, and we can talk about why salmon in particular, but for the Maliseet is it absolutely an essential species, not only for food, but for religion, for spiritual, cultural sustenance, and the like. And then lastly, even the basics of sharing are difficult. We've had lots of round-around conversations about simple words. We have the US-Canadian problem, whether it's government to government, is that what we're talking about? Nation to nation, what does it even mean to be a nation versus a tribe versus a band? So sometimes we can't even get past the basic uses of language, ultimately to move up to the notion of reconciliation. So I would close to say that I think being able to really do these processes does require good consensus building, And it does require evaluators to help us think, what can we learn from these complex processes and do better over time? And I think we're only beginning to figure this out. And unfortunately, I think so much of this is so complicated and there's always so little money for actual evaluation, as you probably all know, that we often don't learn. We just kind of guess and keep fumbling around in the dark. So.
Okay. Yeah, good morning. So I come from an, okay, I'll put on my timer also. I come from a conservation organization, the Global Environment Facility, which is a fairly large internationally funded organization that is supposed to finance the implementation of 5 multilateral environmental conventions. And we've, in the 26 years of its existence, we've been funding something like more than $17 billion worth of projects and raised $75 billion in co-financing. So it's big, and our donors are very keen on us showing results, and evaluation is in a central place in the organization. And in particular, the donors want us to have quantification of results. So what the GEF is accountable for is basically generating global environmental benefits through reduced deforestation, land degradation, biodiversity loss, carbon sequestration, and so forth. And so we have to provide quantitative evidence of that this has happened, actually. So we have started in our office, we have started using things like geospatial methods, big data, using remote sensing data, machine learning to identify what has actually happened. And it's actually quite useful in that sense that you can use, for example, time series data from satellite imagery, which shows you what has happened in an ecosystem, from the point of view of forest cover, vegetation productivity, and so forth. And you can also then use it to set up control sites somewhere else and compare and so forth. So it's very Western science based. And actually the GEF constitution, our instrument, defines that all of our work has to be based on science. Okay, so it comes from that. But we have also come to realize that this using just remote sensing data and so forth, it doesn't really tell us what has happened, and it tells us what has happened perhaps on the ecosystem, but not why it has happened. So there's been a certain paradigm shift, I think, in this whole conservation world to a certain degree. And in a way, these sustainable development goals that we have, that all the countries virtually in the world have adopted and that apply to all of the countries, not only developing countries, but every country, including Canada and the United States, have signed on to these. So they talk about integration. They talk about the 3 pillars of social, economic, and environmental sustainability. In reality, though, there's a huge emphasis on social and economic and much less on the environmental. And like my wedding cake here shows, I believe actually that better than the 3 pillars is the analogy of a cake where you have where the environmental is the foundational layer, and if that collapses, then everything else collapses. But they hang together. So 2 decades ago, the GEF worldview was very sort of like focused on purely the conservation aspects, and we didn't care too much of people. We still consider, people as co-benefits. I mean, it's nice if they benefit, but the essence is really to protect the global environment. But so the projects that we had 20 years ago would have what has been referred to as the Mossad model, that you arm guards, you give them AK-47s and Range Rovers, and they shoot all the poachers and arrest the people who are farming or fishing in protected areas and so forth. But that obviously didn't produce the results that we hoped for. So now we have moved into a very different kind of approach also, and now the foundation for our work is that we have to understand and address the drivers of global environmental change, which of course include all the motivations of the people on the ground, and of course then the larger economic and political forces that encroach on the nature. And now we work, for example, we have a emerging policy on working with indigenous people also to work on to understand how we could try to integrate these systems. So, and also what we have done is that we have moved away consciously from the siloed approach, where you had the people who worked on energy issues here in a silo, and the biodiversity conservers here, and they never talked to each other, and they did different, their own things. But now the new programs that we have initiated a couple of years ago are integrated, and they are things like taking deforestation out of agricultural commodity chains. So you have 3 agricultural commodities that account for about 80% of all tropical deforestation, and these are beef, soybeans, and palm oil. So how do you address these? You have to address them in a very integrated manner, and you have to work with the big companies that dominate the markets, but also the smallholders who are supplying them, and the consumers, and the whole chain. This is very, very challenging, and obviously it also puts a lot of challenges on evaluation, and we are still figuring out how to do that. But this is exactly the kind of a situation where the landscapes are coupled nexus systems that include both the natural and human elements. So one of our emerging things that we really try to do is emphasize mixed methods. So while we have to do this quantification and this big data and remote sensing and all of that stuff is useful for that, but we also do have to understand what's happening on the ground and do what we call ground truthing, and go actually to see what is going on and talk to people and understand where they are coming from. So in my final minute, so I'll try to summarize some of these lessons that I think we have had for evaluation, and we've been thinking about this quite a bit lately. One is the thing is that really the tools shouldn't be the ones that drive your evaluation by any means. The theory of change is still very central to what we are doing, but the theory of change should not be narrowly construed as the internal logic of something that you're doing, and then you go just check whether the project did this. I think I'm agreeing with Andy has used the term unconstrained theory of change, which implies that you have to look into the broader system in which all interventions are operating. They obviously everything that we do takes place in an environment. So an environment, both physical environment and the social, economic, and political environment. So we at least preach that when we start an evaluation, we have to understand the broader system and try to locate the intervention in that broader system and draw the system boundaries somehow. And of course, everything hangs together, but you have to still delimit it to be able to understand what's going on. And these are obviously dynamic and complex systems that are constantly moving, so you have to be flexible with your theory of change, and you can't have it just fixed. And when we talk about these coupled natural and human systems, you have to understand also how they work. So another premise that we do when we start an evaluation, we actually look at, for example, scientific literature, that tells about what do we know about these systems before we start, so we don't reinvent the wheel when we start an evaluation. And it is, of course, like Pat was saying, that no one person can have their head around all of this. So it requires that you incorporate, different kinds of people and different kinds of knowledge in these evaluations also. But basically, in all evaluations, I think it's imperative to us that we pay attention to what is happening to the natural system and to the natural environment, and we often don't do that. But every intervention, I would argue, will have an environmental impact, either an unintended or unforeseen or an intended one, and as evaluators we have to draw attention to all of these, and the minimum standard, of course, for any intervention should be do no harm, and it should go on both sides, of course, not only to the natural environment but also to the human environment. So one could argue that my organization did some harm to the human side in the past, but or tried to do, but failed even in that mostly. But it's very important to pay attention to that, and so the evaluation must encompass the environmental sustainability, as well as what drives people's behavior and what are the main driving forces of change, so that this evaluation can then contribute to our increased knowledge and which way we how we can improve our strategies and interventions. And I would just say as final words is that I think that an intervention can only be deemed successful if it produces the desired results and impacts without compromising environmental sustainability. So therefore, we have to figure out how we can incorporate all of these aspects into our evaluations. Thanks.
Okay, so I don't know about you, but my head is kind of completely spinning with these sustainability gurus talking about areas where they've got such deep expertise. I had a bunch of notes coming in here, and as I listen, more stuff comes into my head. So I'm going to have to just browse through what I've got scribbled down here and see if I can pick out probably the big themes. I'm not a sustainability expert, so my background's been more in, I came into evaluation out of organizational psychology, so I'm very interested in organizational culture change and systems change and how we change thinking and behaviors and kind of whole systems.
So I kind of took that approach in figuring out what kind of questions to consider for today. So I thought we kind of got stuck in a little spider web here. So the first question was, how do we get stuck in this space where we seem to be primarily focused on what these guys refer to as the human systems, like kind of thinking within the boundaries of the program, the policy, the initiative, and what its intended outcomes were. We've had, in addition to what you've heard today, we've had various discussions offline, so I'm picking up some of what they've said from there as well. The big one, I think, is kind of this pervasiveness of this Western and colonist worldview that drives policy programming and development. It's about man being the supreme being in charge of all the various resources on planet Earth. All those resources are simply there to serve humans and to be plundered. And there's an emphasis on entitlement rather than responsibility and stewardship. As Sean said, the environment, the regulations, conservationists, those greenies, as we call them where I come from, are simply just annoyances that you've got to get past as you get on with the most important stuff, which is having a good time and making lots of money, right? So business trumps all of those other pesky lefty considerations like the environment. And then you've also got, but this worldview is so deeply entrenched, not just in sort of thinking and it's not just a kind of thinking and reasoning type thing, it's deeply embedded in people's identities, their political identities and their cultural identities. So, you know, we of this, whether it's of this political persuasion or of this industry or of this kind of field, subculture, this is the way we think and this is the way we talk. That's all supported by things like a legal perspective that pushes you to boil everything down to the almighty dollar because, of course, the dollar is the almighty, right? Then we've got things like the psychology and politics of accountability and how people live in fear of being evaluated on anything that's outside what they've got complete control over. So there's a lot of pushback saying, like, don't you dare start looking at that sustainability stuff because that's affected by so many other things than what I do. So I don't want to be hauled over the coals for that. The paying client also likes to keep the focus narrow for that reason. So it's not just the individuals feeling like that, but it's also an organizational thing. But then another kind of barrier, I think, as evaluators, we're pretty strongly wired and conditioned to think inside that requested box, whatever the funder said needs to be covered. So we go cover that off and trying to push for extra time, expertise, scope to be able to look outside that box. It's tough work. Plus, we're a little bit short on that sustainability expertise, right? So thinking about what needs to happen if the evaluation enterprise is to make a shift towards a more coupled systems and sustainability-focused evaluation space. Okay, I've got a whole bunch of things I wrote down here, but I'm going to go with the things that I scribbled. I think the first one is what Andy was said at the beginning, like having one of our guiding core values for all our evaluation work is that whatever we're evaluating needs to be meeting and supporting the needs and aspirations of the communities or whoever that this is supposed to be or needs to be impacting, whatever the intentions of the program are, but without compromising in any way the ability of future generations to enjoy and thrive in the natural environment. So when I think about what we need to shift, I mean, now I'm jumping back to sort of what have we as evaluators got that we can bring to this. It's not just about shifting our beliefs and attitudes, but also thinking, how do we shift our know-how? So one thing is this emphasis in boiling things down to numbers. Like a lot of the methods and tools coming out of this space are very quant, they're very dollar-oriented, and they don't do a great job of capturing some stuff that's really important but quite intangible and a little bit difficult to measure. So things like, you know, cultural significance or thinking in multiple generations in terms of sustainability and outcomes. Another thing I think that we need to bring to the table is pushing people to ask high-level questions. So not stopping at saying, what were the outcomes, or even stopping at saying how good were the outcomes, but asking that next higher level question of things like how well is this initiative trading off the various benefits and drawbacks as we think across those two coupled systems. That's going to require a lot of that consensus building and high involvement. It's going to require that broader, unconstrained theory of change that was mentioned here. But in the end, we need to choose important evaluation questions and then choose and design and invent and create question-driven methods and tools, not have the questions driven by the methods. How many times have you said to stakeholders, what are your questions about this? And they say, well, we want to know how much indicator X has shifted. They're limiting their question to what they know is measurable. Now, they're not the experts in measurement and evaluation, we are, so we dream about this stuff every night. So I always tell clients if they're saying, oh, but we can't really measure that, say, well, you know, there are people sitting in ivory towers who study for their lifetime love. They've figured out how to measure love. So if you can spend an entire lifetime as a social scientist measuring love, then why the hell can't you measure some of these other things like cultural capital, sustainability, and do it in ways that are more than just the traditional numbers that don't really speak to the heart side of it. Okay, where do we start? Okay, I think I was trying to think, first of all, where are we with our heads and hearts with this stuff? There are going to be some of us on various different, as we listen to this stuff, it's like, how on board are we, people, right? So which category are you in? Are you one of the innovators, like these sustainability gurus who are like, yeah, let's invent something new that we can get out and do this? Are you an early adopter where you're like, that sounds like a great idea, now can you just tell me how to do it? Or are you sort of the wait and see early majority who you think might be a good idea, but I just want to see a few runs on the board before I jump in? Then you've got the late majority folks who are a little bit wary about this, and they're more looking for political reasons to shift. You know, at what point do I start looking like a pain in the butt change resistor when everyone else is getting on board and now it's time to... So they're more doing it for political reasons. Then you've got your resistors, apathetic, pretty much just duck, ignore it, hope it goes away. The next thing will come around soon and we won't have to worry about it. Then the ones you've really got to keep an eye on, the saboteurs. So they'll work passively or actively to undermine the whole idea because they're fundamentally into it. Now, the people you've really got to watch with this are people for whom plundering natural resources and ignoring the sustainability issue is actually part of their cultural and political identity and part of who they define who they are. So those are going to be the ones that are hardest to shift. You can't shift them with reason. There are different strategies to try and shift those folks. Some ideas that have popped up in conversations for the little people like us, like me, the solo evaluator, what do I do about this? So one is, pick the brains of some of these gurus here, but also I'm thinking there's some ways to kind of get the best of both worlds where I can actually tap into two kinds of expertise at the same time. Some of our amazing Indigenous experts have built into their ways of thinking this multi-generational, sustainable thinking that, so when you're tapping into that expertise, but like just tap into the sustainability aspect of their expertise as well, then you get two for the price of one. That probably means you should be paying them double because it's double the value. So anyway, work that one, my Indigenous colleagues. Another thought was really trying to reassure the client that although you're looking outside the box of what they're actually able to control, this is not about holding them personally accountable necessarily, but it's about identifying the constraints that stop them from being able to do what really needs to be done. So it's more about commenting on the system sitting around them, the context in which they're operating, rather than when we evaluate things only inside the box, it's almost like there's an assumption that you can control everything. So when you start talking about context, I think that's actually helpful for programs and people. Now, one thing I want to say is that we've actually, this may look like it's going to be hard work to push and get people thinking differently. It's not just evaluators, it's clients, it's those big influential organizations that set the agenda for all kinds of evaluation around the world. Especially in places like international development, where you've got these big heavy hitters setting agendas for everybody else. But we've actually been here and we've done some of this already on multiple different fronts. Once upon a time, evaluation was defined as measuring whether a program met its objectives. So actually, part of what we're trying to do with sustainability is say, yeah, remember when we talked to you about how side effects are actually, and side impacts are actually important? Well, this is just another form of that, and of course we look at those. Now, it's always hard to tell clients, like, I'm going to look at stuff other than what you intended to do, but we have to keep pushing on that, and we already do that. Things like using mixed methods, where you've got clients that have got preferences for particular kinds of metrics, and you're saying, those are nice bones, but we need to put some flesh on them. Pushing to use evaluation-specific methodology, saying it's not just about what the results were, but how good they were. So you've got to push for that when people aren't aware of it. Culturally responsive evaluation and bringing in Indigenous perspectives, or making them the base for a lens for how you look at the entire program or initiative. We've just got to keep bashing on those doors and convincing people. So, I want to encourage us to think, like, who are the key influences that we have access to that we can just push their thinking a little bit more, keep chipping. All of us have a go, we'll get somewhere. I know I'm running short of time. So in closing, I want to say that this is, in the same way as culturally responsive evaluation is not something that we just apply to those cultural programs, sustainability is not just something we apply to just those environmental programs. Right? It's something that's the responsibility of all of us. Ultimately, it's about our relationship with Mother Earth. We don't own her, she owns us. And if we screw up, guess what? Mother Earth is the most kick-ass meta-evaluator that you will ever be in your face about this. Just saying. Kia ora.
Great. Thank you to the panel for doing a superb job of staying to time. Let's just hear, does anyone have sort of comments picking up on the panel, have comments picking up from what Jane has said or what the others have said about what you've heard the others say and what you might bring to evaluation, or what evaluation needs to attend to? And if not, we'll just go to the audience. If you do, let's.
Well, I mean, I had a question actually as I was listening to Nan and Kate. When we think about Indigenous evaluation and the question of who should be leading it, I have a question about, like, under what circumstances should sustainability gurus be leading in this space, or Indigenous experts or evaluators with a sustainability bent be leading in this space, and when is it appropriate to pull in the expertise, and when does that kind of dumb or like tokenism, or it's going to be too light? I don't know, who drives it and why?
I think that's a hard one, and I was listening to Sean talking about those situations where you've got these essentially these conflicting tensions or conflicting principles, which is what you go to work with every day. In that space, it felt like what we're trying to achieve, at least, is a coming together, and I think it is I'm trying to think of words like co-leadership, co-responsibilities, when we can get to a space. But at some point there has to be someone who's driving or navigating. But I mean, driving with your, but keeping people on board. So I think it's pretty tough. I mean, I think that is about a coming together. I like, being totally not biased, I like to think that, we as Māori look to be inclusive. We look to both obviously have our principles and values affirmed, but that's not about dissing somebody else's values. That's about also, recognising that they are important and valuable. So it's how you work that line. But I'm not sure, Jane. how you make that happen. I think 3 years. I think 3 years is a very short time. Truly, we've been on our treaty claims, which is about resolving those tensions, and what are we, 75? So how many years is that? 38, 48? Yeah. So our Mother Earth's got a really long time. So yeah, we just have a time frame that is often very, very short. But when you think about intergenerational transmission, when you think about responsibility to leave something not for your children, but for your grandchildren's grandchildren, then we need to take the time to get it right.
It's an interesting observation where you say 3 years is not long. I think I would agree in one sense, and the group I'm working with, one of the biggest benefits that has come so far out of the 3 years together is that we don't have any new tools. Is that it's back to what Pat talked about, is really what's on top of the issues is really that relationship and reconciliation. So amongst the group, there is a very solid level of trust, a very solid level of comfort to exchange information that was never been able to do before. It was always very guarded because it was in the realm of politics and negotiation. And so this is a without prejudice conversation, and it's transformed how everyone is viewing. And with that, it kind of comes back to something that was also mentioned around I need my glasses here, the psychology and politics of accountability is key, because it's that trust is going right at that piece, and it's challenging me, it's challenging our organization, and I think the broader government and industry in BC, is that once you have that relationship, you can start going after those identities, like the saboteurs you talked about. I know companies, and we regulate companies that are saboteurs, and we're very aware of what they do, and so how we approach them in this relationship is very different than how we approach the innovators that want to see change and are willing to move forward on things. So a couple comments.
Yeah, I think really these evaluations, I mean, the sustainability gurus, as you call them, wouldn't have all the knowledge either. So it has to be a partnership, an effort where you bring knowledge from different places, from Western science and from indigenous peoples and from everybody else who is there. But one of the things that I think you started mentioning about that, these time frames, for example, are very, very different on natural and human systems, and the projects that we are working on are usually, 3, 4, 5, 6, if we are lucky, years long. But the natural cycles are much longer, and even if we are targeting them through a project, so the impacts actually on the ground take much longer. And so, for example, we did recently a global evaluation of our land degradation portfolio, and we found that to see the actual positive changes on the ground takes approximately 4 to 5 years after the project has closed. So let's say it's a 10-year time frame before you see anything, and that's a huge challenge for our donors and especially their political masters who want to see, concrete, measurable changes within the project lifetime, and this is an education that we have to also. I'm constantly trying to educate our board on these kind of things, that do not expect that you can measure these huge ecosystems changes and improvements within this cycle that you want.
What I was just going to add, I thought Jane raised the good question of how do evaluators hopefully expand their clients' thinking of how to look at problems or issues. And I think that's actually a really hard one, because I'm a consultant too, and you're often constrained by the person who's funding the project, as you just noted, including time frame. And I think one potential to that is actually joint evaluation, is that using consensus building and saying, look, I don't know exactly all the things we should measure or all the metrics or indicators we should look at, But let's ask some of these folks who are stakeholders or rights holders in these issues. Important distinction between the two, I think we could talk about later. And let's just have a conversation, at least, to say, what do we think other people think we should measure? What do they care about? And let's see if we can think about at least framing the problem jointly. Because I think a lot of what we try to do in consensus building is understand that lots of problems, actually, the framing of the problem and what the problem actually is in dispute, let alone the solution. And if we can bring people together to actually frame that first, then we might be in a different and better place.
It's such a great panel. I find I never have to say anything with these people. So I'd like to open it up now to all of you to ask questions, make comments, contribute to the journey that we're starting.
Hi there, thank you.
I better stand up so I can see.
You're right, this is an amazing panel, and that was my comment as well. So I have two things that I wanted to say. I think this is the type of panel that should be presenting to the ministers and the deputy ministers of CERNA and ISC. That's Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada and Indigenous Services Canada, the two departments that the department formerly known as INAC. And as well as Indigenous organizations in Canada, because I think this is where we need to start. And they need to hear this message because they're the ones that approve our evaluation terms of reference and evaluation frameworks, et cetera. And they're also deeply committed right now to co-creation of both the policy and evaluation. So the timing is so right. As well as provincial governments, they need to hear this message as well. And back in, a few years ago, there was, at the American Evaluation Association conference in Denver, Colorado, the whole focus of the conference was on this theme. And the whole panel right at the beginning of the conference, to open it up, was saying we need to incorporate environmental sustainability into our evaluations. And the room was dead silent, and people went away and did their other sessions, and it's just really, it wasn't taken up. But the time is now. It's gonna be taken up. And one way I think that we could do that, and the idea we were discussing it back then in Denver, was we need to include environmental sustainability as one of the major lenses that we do when we do evaluations. And Treasury Board in Canada can add questions, and they're asking us to put certain lenses on our evaluations right now, and it's in the policy, and they're obliging everybody to do it, like gender-based analysis, for example. But the environment is urgent. Like, that is the thing that we should be putting as the primary lens on all evaluations right now. So I think that's one solution, and I'd love to hear. It's not a solution, it's one avenue. So I'm wondering what do you think of those ideas?
I think it's appropriate to note, to add to what you said, which is very helpful, is that at its AGM yesterday, the day before, the Canadian Evaluation Society created a task force to develop sustainability-ready CES and evaluation in Canada. So part of that task force work will be following up on exactly what you're talking about, and your inputs to that would be very helpful.
Kolomosi, Nikki Bowman from Packer Cheesehead, Wisconsin, USA. First of all, I would just like to commend and thank the courageousness of our Nijosuk, Shwanik Nijosuk. I'm not sure how I feel about white settler ally. I'm still processing that, but in my language, I just say my European friend. My European friends, and for the Canadian Eval Society for putting this together. I think the hashtag duh of us, all of our brains in the room here, is the missing voice to me. Was what's brilliant is our European friends, and talking about what's working and what's not working, and when the questions came in, being able to model that. That's what's missing in the discourse of culturally responsive and co-creation. And the way that we're framing it and doing it, we would call it of good minds and being in a good way. And I think that's very important to our profession. And so I just wanted to thank everyone for doing that very purposefully and explicitly. I think other than CREA, the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment in Illinois under Dr. Stafford Hood, I think nobody is comparable to what CES is doing here. And then my question is, as somebody who, I'm looking at governance and legal theories and methods because sovereignty and treaty rights are so very important, and it would just be great if as we continue this sustainable work, how do we build capacity to show sustainable efforts or partnerships with tribes where it is working, where you do have nation-to-nation agreements? That's what's going to help solidify a continuance of not only a partnership, but the empowerment of Indigenous people. Because when it comes to brass tacks, it is about money and power, many of our communities don't have money, so we need our allies. Because we end up having to sue for our rights, our inherent rights of what we've given up. And I can't speak eloquently about the Canadian context, but I feel comfortable in the lower 48. And so I just hope to see more of these multi-jurisdictional agreements being available and helping build the capacity. So Mr. Pipeline, I went, oh boy. Nan and I had the same look on our face. And so my spirit sees your spirit. I'm trying to get my head out of the way, and I really appreciate you being here, and especially as an Indigenous person, but we have to start somewhere, and your face might be it. If it's not, I'm sending Grandma after you with that mean eye.
Any comments from the panel?
I feel I should comment. I like to get the last word in sometimes, but the capacity is it's a fundamental piece that our organization and the provincial government and British Columbia does provide a fair bit of capacity. I think the argument is, how much, and it's generally never enough. But it's part of the kind of the hierarchy of approaches we would take when we talk about relationship building and relationship work on a specific project. It does come, and there is an expectation, and we do budget and bring money forward. We always do that for capacity for the bands that we work with, just for the very issues that you're talking about. The question is, it's never enough, and then I think the struggle that we see looking in is that there's so much happening and there's so much engagement in British Columbia as which, from the community point of view, is which activity do you focus on? And so I think it's an observation, an additional struggle is that there is capacity, there is engagement, there is interest, but now it's a question of which activity, which process that you do look at. So, and on the pipeline comment, I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
I might just add, when we've had questions about capacity in your comments, and Jane's question about, well, who will be taking the lead? What do we have to be? It's not that evaluators have to suddenly become competent at working in two systems and fully fluent in all three overlapping knowledges, the natural system knowledge, social system knowledge, and Indigenous knowledge. It's that we have to engage that and very much the process. And I think the collective response from the panel was that's what we need to do. There is an example in the United States, and I apologize, I know there must be examples in British Columbia, but I don't know them. And it's the Warm Springs tribe, which is located in the state that we call Oregon. It's up in the Deschutes area. And 15 years ago, the Warm Springs tribe were the enemies of the federal and state regulators of the environment, and regarded as untrustworthy and unreliable in terms of the way that they interacted with the natural system. Today, the Warm Springs tribe is the leading natural resource management organization in the state of Oregon. and actually in the broad watersheds of Oregon, Washington, and the headlands that come further inland. And they did that by combining human and natural systems and developing capacities and sitting it thoroughly within traditional values and not going faster than their elders, not going faster than their community. And they are the living model of what we need to achieve as evaluators. You're first, and then you.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the organizing committee for thinking of having this panel, and thank you each panelist for coming and sharing your thoughts. My question may have been partially answered by Natalia, the woman who first spoke. And it's really playing off what Jane had said and what Patrick had said. So having these dialogues in the format of an evaluation proposal is a step. It's a risky step for the person having that dialogue in moving this forward. So my question to you, and I'd like to pick your brains on this. So Andy has already proposed that we do have a working group at CES. So my question to you is, what are your ideas and thoughts on where else evaluation can contribute and have these dialogues so that this does become standard practice and it isn't just at the individual evaluator level? How can we, where are the levers, where are the opportunities to bring other ways of doing this transformation within the systems that we currently work in? Thank you.
Can we turn to the far end of the table for that?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know whether it's we trick people. I mean, when we talk about what we're able to do at home, do you think that they just accept it blindly? I mean, we've been creating, inverted commas, a story, but I mean a rationale about why we think working in a particular way adds value to their organisation, to their objectives, to their goals. So what we have to do is make them see the value of what we're doing or the way we're advocating something, so that what we're offering or suggesting isn't something that's just about us, but actually is able to share, create value for the clients or the organisations that we're working with. You know, in all honesty, sometimes it's opportunistic. Sometimes we have a good client who gets it, but we've just become skilled at actually, I don't know, what's the words? At being able to show or demonstrate in different ways why doing something in a particular way, whether it's Indigenous or whether it's basing all our work on tribal places, why that adds value to the evaluation and why that adds value to the information that we will gather in that particular way to their organisational goals, etc. And also why of course it makes sense for us to do it in this way. So it isn't like everybody is always just waiting and say, hey, you go girl, or you go Māori, or you go. We still, we are the minority. We're 15% of the population. And so we still have to speak back to the powers that be. And the way that I like to do that is by, you know, it's absolutely valuable and important to us, but actually there is good, great, fantastic value in us being able to work in this way. So they've got a rationale which they can speak back to their board and to their senior management and their executive. Sometimes it doesn't work, you know, sometimes we have to work in the box. But that's the only, they have to have a reason, they have to want to do something different, and they have to see the value in it, not just for us as Māori or Indigenous, but for their own organisations or their own aspirations.
I actually advocate for being a little bit subversive as well. So, you know, the client says, here's what we want, blah, 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 and you're like, sure. And then, you know, you just slip some good stuff in anyway. And, like, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission, because people will limit what they'll let you do by what their own experience tells them is possible or what they assume you're going to do with it. So my policy as a subversive evaluator is you saddle up. You saddle up whatever Trojan horse you need to get the good stuff in the door, then you let it out, and all hell breaks loose. So, you know, but you get it in there and you show what's possible, because they won't believe you up front when you're sort of telling them in theory what's possible, but you kind of have to show them rather than tell them. So slip it in there any way you can, and just, because, you know, we all do little bits like that, and eventually it breaks through.
Look, I couldn't agree more. And I've got a couple of examples of, you know, in New Zealand where we've been really subversive. You know, you write the evaluation proposal and you talk about using evaluation-specific methodology, you dress it up in all the nice evaluation words. But what that actually means, that methodology, is you front-end the process with a values-based discussion, with values-based consensus building about what matters in this space. They don't realise that's how you're going to kick it off. But what that does is unleash everything that we've talked about. What it does mean that as evaluators, we have to be prepared to have those conversations, to be able to, do need the skills, or we need to bring them in to have those collaborative conversations, to have those really tough conversations. So yeah, I totally agree, Jane, and I think, you know, I remember sitting in a room with a group of people. It was a resource management piece of work where we're brought in as evaluators to work on a collaborative stakeholder group process to set policy for water allocation. And most of the people around the table had never experienced evaluation before, and we were required to sign legal documents at the front end about confidentiality, and we were only allowed to speak to them off the record at the start. But by the end, they were blown away by what evaluation could bring to the process of collaboration and decision-making around water allocation. So yeah, you know, we can be subversive. I think it's totally legitimate.
I would just like to add that I support all of that.
First, thank you to the panel. I think you've really stimulated our thinking this morning. But I'd like to pick up, Patrick, with something you said about stakeholders versus rights holders, because that kind of, I think I know where you're going with that, but I'd just like to hear you say a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, and other people probably would want to weigh in here as well. So I think for a long time in my business of consensus building, we call everybody out there who might participate in a dialogue a stakeholder. And many Indigenous people reminded us that's not exactly right, that if you're an Indigenous person, you have basic, whether fundamental rights, treaty rights, rights in constitutional cases, whatever it might be, and a rights holder who has a set of rights, a bundle of rights, is actually different than a stakeholder, and has a different role and a different place in the dialogue and a different position and a different kind of paying attention or awareness that needs to happen. So I think in our work we become much more cognizant, not in the US and Canada, but also overseas, about this notion of rights holders versus stakeholders. Now, we can get into a long discussion about who has rights, what bundle of rights, and that can be kind of messy, but I think it's an important distinction to think about First Peoples as having rights, and it's different than the role of NGOs. They are, you know, again, Indigenous peoples may have communities, but they are not municipalities. We really need to understand important distinctions.
Can I also add that I think our natural world is a rights holder, and I guess one of the things that some of you may know already, but in New Zealand, one of our rivers has just received personhood status as part of a negotiation with one of our tribes. So the Wanganui River has rightshood in legal status, and I think one of our national parks has just received the same with another tribe in the North Island, has received personhood rights status, and I think, you know, that gives us somewhere to go.
Yes.
Thanks, Andy, and I do want to thank the panel for some very thought-provoking comments. There was a statement, something around that we need science to tell us what to do, and it seems to me that science has been saying no, but nobody is really listening or taking action. And I'm old enough to remember the Brundtland report and all the IPCC reports. I'm an opponent of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but I had to laugh yesterday when the mayor of Spruce Grove used evaluation to provide arguments in favor of the safety of the pipeline. And I wanted to respond to his comment, but because I believe that the outcomes of fossil fuel consumption are very bad for Canada as a whole. The weather this week, fires in Fort Mac, I don't need to say any more. But I didn't because I felt very vulnerable and very hypocritical because, like many people in this room, I flew to this conference, which currently accounts for 8% of greenhouse gases. So my question is, what can we do as professionals to connect and learn in rich environments like this, but not continue the face-to-face standard meetings?
Does anyone from the audience want to contribute to that? Well, I think there are things. Andrelisa organized discount on Via Rail, which is something that we need to institutionalize. As bad as our rail system is, it still gets us there, and it's often a pleasant trip. So there's a whole bunch of low-hanging fruit things we can do. Obviously, we have to use more communication, more Skype or whatever, GoToMeeting, all that sort of stuff. But let's not forget that servers are huge generators. All these banks of servers are great generators of heat and producers of greenhouse gases. I think we have some profound challenges trying to figure that out. The solutions are probably found in the type of approaches that you could see in the International Resources Panel, the IRP, which is another, like the Climate Change Panel is another global panel sent up by the UN. And the IRP's focus is on the circular economy. So really we start eliminating waste, we start recycling, we start changing our products, we start changing our behaviors so that we become more, that's the avenue and the route to greater sustainability. And if you think about one of the scarce minerals that is in flat screens, and it's not this rare earth stuff, the way that we have enough, we're going to run out of capacity to be able to build flat screens fairly soon because this mineral is being exhausted. And the way that flat screens are designed, it can't be recovered in recycling processes. So that I think we're reaching thresholds where we are going to have to find ways of doing this, and we're going to get creative, and a lot of creative stuff is happening now. In my opening slide, I started with a slide from Eileen Fisher, who is an impressive organization, the way they've adopted sustainability. Many other private sectors firms are, and we will learn lessons from them. Last question.
Hi everyone, my name's Jeff. I'm feeling very intellectually stimulated right now, so thank you for that. I will try to keep my question as coherent and concise as possible. To begin, I guess my guiding mantra is that I need to be systematic and neutral, and that I won't always be in a position to evaluate as any particular interest group. So with that in mind, I'm thinking about the end product of an evaluation. And my question to the panel, and actually to the whole society, is whether or not the evaluation community should have one more role in being able to put forth recommendations that establish or find a point of consensus in systems that are inherent and perpetually in a state of conflict. Patrick, deep in one of your slides, you had one of the options of consensus building is to invent options for mutual gain. And just incidentally, it was the last step before the evaluation step. And I'm wondering if, as evaluators, that's possibly the greatest contribution we could make, is to find what exactly are these options for mutual gain in something as inherently contentious and conflictual and complicated as the issue we're talking about today.
I never thought of evaluators as mediators, but I think that's an interesting question, actually. And again, I want to just challenge you on your last statement. Even myself, I don't think anybody is neutral because I think we're all forced and use and make value judgments all the time. So really briefly, I'll be a very short soapbox, is that, years ago doing work in the Everglades, phosphorus poured in through the sugarcane industry, completely transformed the ecosystem. Now we're spending gobs of money to try to restore it. And an ecologist said the Everglades doesn't care, actually. If you pour phosphorus into it, it adapts. So what we decide the Everglades should be 50 years from now is a value-based decision. Nature's not gonna wait. Nature's just gonna do what it does. And so I think it's interesting to think that even evaluators and all of us are making value judgments all the time. We have to decide which values, I guess, are more important than others. That's the kind of judgment making we have to do. I do think it's interesting, and I think you all know this far better than I do, that we've often in the old days taught evaluation as kind of an end product at the end of everything, but that's not very helpful if you're trying to be adaptive and learn as you go. So in very complex processes where evaluators are participating all the way along to help the process and the group adjust from kind of an independent standpoint, and maybe helping stimulate thinking and maybe better option generation, and maybe through that process of sort of evaluation ongoing, we end up with better processes and maybe less conflict or better ideas. So I wholeheartedly support evaluation as kind of a partnership through a process, not just at the end.
We have about 3 minutes to, so I was going to give the panel a last minute, but I'm not going to. I'm taking the last 2 minutes. And the first thing I want to do is thank the panel. They've been a joy to work with. Sustainability shares an origin as a problem and as something for us to do. It shares an origin with Indigenous, that it comes from a sense of dominion over peoples, over everything else. And we need to have our own analogs for decolonizing that dominion, that sense of dominion amongst the evaluation community, building the capacities amongst evaluators to work with other sciences and other knowledge sources to be able to incorporate sustainability, to develop sustainability-ready evaluation. And as Juha said, and as Jane said, this is not just something, oh, that's a natural resource issue, it's over there. It is everything that Indigenous touches, which is a lot more than we even acknowledge or recognize now. And it's everything that you touch as evaluators, whether in education systems or health systems. The expanded theory of change, the expanded worldview that we have to learn how to successfully bring to evaluations is part of an educational process by which we're going to contribute to improving the sustainability of the world. And we have the responsibility, the position that some of us take is that you have to actually confirm that this is not a coupled human and natural system that you're working on before you're allowed to not deal with sustainability. And I think if we take that lens and we take that approach, then we can successfully create a story that weaves together evaluation as we know it now and to what evaluation will become, which is an evaluation-ready evaluation working side by side with evaluation done for and by Indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.